Hello everyone. I'm hoping this video won't be uncomfortable for anyone. Sluts. You love them? You hate them? But why do we have this relationship with so-called sluts? Why does women expressing their sexuality in certain ways cause such visceral reactions in people? Okay, obvious question. Or is it? It's very easy to armchair psychoanalyze people, but I'd like to ask you to leave your preconceived notions aside and focus on the research presented. Because I did that and I don't want to be the only one. God damn it. You may have seen the claim that men prefer debt-free virgins without tattoos. First of all, it's worth noting that this statement is an oversimplification. A 2020 Pew Research poll found that half of all Christians say that casual sex between consenting adults is sometimes or always acceptable, and the vast majority of the religiously unaffiliated said that casual sex was acceptable. Maybe if they had introduced the concept of women's virginity specifically, it would have skewed the data, but it takes two to tango, if you get me. Now, this is to say nothing of preferences, of course. It could still be the case that men prefer virgins, even if they're willing to settle for a woman who has had casual sex. And it could be the case that men will tolerate certain things in other people's relationships versus their own relationships. So, to move on to another study, let's talk about a study published in the Journal of Sex Research, which corroborates the idea that men want women who don't have a substantial sexual history. However, the study is tellingly entitled, Sexual History and Present Attractiveness. People want a mate with a bit of a past, but not too much. It states, using an internet survey, 188 participants rated their willingness to engage in a relationship with a hypothetical individual with a specified number of past sexual partners, ranging from 0 to 60 plus. The effect of past partner number was very large. Average willingness ratings initially rose as past partner number rose, but then fell dramatically. For short-term relationships, men were more willing than women to get involved, although the difference was not large. For long-term relationships, in contrast, there was virtually no sex difference. Thus, contrary to the idea that male promiscuity is tolerated but female promiscuity is not, both sexes express equal reluctance to get involved with someone with an overly extensive sexual history. Finally, participants with an unrestricted sociosexual orientation, high SO participants, were more tolerant than low SO participants of prospective mates with higher numbers of past sexual partners, but were also less tolerant of prospective mates with low numbers of past sexual partners. While this study has a limited sample size, it does have the advantage of being an online survey, thus circumventing the social desirability bias. The reason why I bring up these studies first is that they show you right out the gate what the general trend in their research on sexual promiscuity is right now. That trend is that people generally prefer social conservatism, but not always, and that when they do prefer social conservatism, it's usually not a clean, positive correlation between lower number of sexual partners and positive social evaluations. Another study from the Journal of Sex Research is entitled, Has Virginity Lost Its Virtue? Relationship Stigma Associated with Being a Sexually Inexperienced Adult. This study analyzed a whopping 1.1 million American men and 800,000 American women between 25 and 45. The study had this to say, in the current research, we examined the impact of being developmentally off time with first coitus, i.e. not yet engaging in coitus when most same-age peers have done so. Specifically, we investigated stigma towards sexually inexperienced adults and discrimination regarding romantic relationship formation. Across 3 methodologically diverse studies, we observed that sexually inexperienced adults perceived themselves to be stigmatized due to their inexperience, and that sexually inexperienced adults were not highly desired as relationship partners. Even sexually inexperienced adults themselves did not find other inexperienced adults to be attractive relationship partners. Although abstaining from sexual activity may bestow some health advantages, our studies show that being a sexual late bloomer may result in negative interpersonal consequences, such as limited opportunities for romantic relationships. It further notes, While research shows stigma associated with being sexually permissive, violation of normative scripts for the timing of sexual debut by way of non-engagement is also likely to result in negative evaluation. In the current research, we investigated perceptions of and stigma toward sexually inexperienced adults. The introductory line of the general discussion section reads, "While premarital chastity was once historically valued, today premarital sex is normative." While the idea that sluts are not desirable remains true, we immediately see a more nuanced picture when we actually look at the data. But at the end of the day, sexual conservatism is still, to some degree, the norm, and slut shaming remains very common. So the question is why? Is it really biological? If so, how strong are these biological mechanisms? How common is slut shaming, and should something be done about it? According to a study in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, slut shaming is defined as the stigmatization of an individual based on his or her appearance, sexual availability, and actual or perceived sexual behavior. I am nothing if not a blind, liberal sheep who trusts the piece of paper instead of the truth in front of his own eyes, bro. So I'm going to be using the scientific definition here. So the first thing to establish about slut shaming is, how common is it? Well, according to Kathleen Roy and et alia, it is pretty common among adolescents. This study is from Flanders in Belgium, so keep in mind that these might not be strictly representative of American numbers. The study says, in total, 18.7% of the female adolescents in our sample were at least once called slut, whore, or similar names on SNS in the past 6 months preceding the survey, and perceived this as harassing, i.e. unwelcome. In Table 1, the frequency of being slut-shamed on SNS is present. Even 10.4% of our sample did not just experience this once, but at least a few times in this 6 months. Among the slut-shamed victims, 80.7% perceived this incident as severe, whereas 19.3% did not think it was severe. The first thing you might notice is the usage of the word severe. And that's because slut-shaming is a phenomenon that was found to be linked more generally to sexual harassment, and is indeed itself a type of sexual harassment if done in a certain way under certain circumstances. Because of this, we also sometimes have to reckon with the negative mental health outcomes that sometimes come with sexual harassment more generally. Even when not coupled with sexual harassment, slut-shaming has been demonstrated to have negative impacts on the mental health of women. What further complicates the picture is the binary way in which we categorize the sexual behavior of women. According to a meta-analysis from the University of Connecticut, women were faced with a Madonna-whore dichotomy. They were either pure and virginal or promiscuous and easy. This lack of middle ground then plays into the double bind that women are faced with. Either they withhold sex and are run through the mud by men who pursue them, or they give sex and are labeled as whores and sluts. Moreover, exposure to gender stereotype beliefs, such as about the value of female chastity versus male chastity, can also have its own negative consequences. Here, I'm going to be drawing from a meta-analysis entitled, "He is a Stud, She is a Slut," a meta-analysis on the continued existence of sexual double standards. Within this context, sexual double standards means that, quote, the present analysis focuses on heterosexual double standards, SDS, in which different sexual behaviors are expected of and valued for men and women. Traditionally, men/boys are expected to be sexually active, dominant, and the initiator of heterosexual activity, whereas women/girls are expected to be sexually reactive, submissive, and passive. Moreover, traditionally men are granted more sexual freedom than women. As a consequence, men and women can be treated differently for the same sexual behaviors. For example, slut-shaming is experienced by 50% of girls compared with 20% of boys. The analysis had this to say. Furthermore, traditional SDS, that means sexual double standards, have been associated with gender differences in sexual coercion and violence, as well as in sexual pleasure and achieving orgasms. SDS have also been associated with gender differences in sexual risk behavior, specifically with more sexual partners for men and more reluctance to request or insist on condom use for women. Traditional SDS have further been related to other societal problems, such as homophobia, sexism, and gender inequality. In short, traditional beliefs about gender are tied with slut shaming, which is tied with numerous negative outcomes. You might be thinking right now, well, I don't care if it's men or women, I don't want anyone to be overly promiscuous.
So, naturally, nearly every society has also set up rules relating to sex. Though not always perfect, these rules have existed for both men and women in order to instill social stability. Personally, I don't pat anyone on the back for their sexual conquests. I think it's super gross to use something so special and intimate as a tool to gain social status.
However, if you think that, it's nice that you don't single out women specifically, but the numbers alone demonstrate that this is not the norm, and that's not the only thing that demonstrates this. According to the meta-analysis from earlier, Rice classified participants into one of the 4 subtypes based on their responses to individual items, and on the differences between their responses to the same items with a male versus a female referent. Overall, 42% of the student samples endorsed abstinence from premarital intercourse, with a sizable minority endorsing permissiveness with 19%, and without 7% affection. An orthodox double standard was endorsed by 11%, and a transitional double standard by 14%. The adult sample was more conservative, with 77% endorsing abstinence, only 11% endorsing some form of permissiveness, and 9% endorsing some degree of double standard. These overall results were influenced by other variables. For example, in both student and adult samples, women were far more likely than men to endorse abstinence, and men more likely than women to endorse double standards. Rice maintained that although the orthodox double standard was a minority attitude, egalitarianism had not yet been achieved. Double standards were evident within the abstinence and permissiveness categories as well as the double standard category itself. For example, a respondent might endorse abstinence from intercourse for both sexes, but believe that only men were entitled to kiss and pet without relational affection or commitment. In short, many people profess that men should be held to a different standard than women, and many who say that they should be equally celibate actually reveal double standards and other aspects of their belief systems. So, while the narrative that boys are praised for their sexual prowess and women are shamed for thinking about are oversimplified, there is truth to the idea that subtle gender double standards surrounding sex permeate our society. Women deemed to be sluts face a greater amount of scrutiny and negative evaluations from their peers, and these negative evaluations are more extensive than you might think. According to a paper entitled Birds of a Feather, Not When It Comes to Sexual Permissiveness, extensive research demonstrates the general undesirability of sexual permissiveness. Sexual experience in a friend or a partner is invariably rated as less desirable than sexual restraint, and is often among the least desirable traits. In school-based sociometric studies, permissive adolescents, particularly girls, are often nominated as less liked and popular, and hypothetical permissive targets are judged as less desirable friends, dating partners, and spouses, and are viewed as less moral, likable, intelligent, trustworthy, and adjusted. Vaillancourt and Sharma, 2011, also found a greater need for mate guarding from permissive females among women. No men were sampled. Okay, so hopefully by now I've established successfully that slut shaming can have negative consequences. But this still leaves us with many questions. Are there positive aspects to slut shaming that we still want to keep around? If so, do these factors outweigh the negatives? Why do people slut shame? Is slut shaming a universal phenomenon or something more culturally specific? Probably the most common layman hypothesis about why slut shaming occurs is this kind of biological investment hypothesis. Stop me if you've heard this one before. Women have to invest more into childbirth than men, which encourages women to be more selective about sexual partners, whereas men have a lower investment in the childbearing process, so they are encouraged to go out and get all the pussy. Scientists and pretentious people call these the Bateman-Trivers principles. These biological imperatives then morph into social norms about how men and women should act in society. I am pretty skeptical about this hypothesis. However, it's worth noting that there are scientists who do put some stock in this belief. This belief is bolstered by the cross-cultural tendency for men to be more likely to consent to casual sex, and the cross-cultural tendency for women to be more selective about who they have sex with. But while the analysis has a lot of validity, and can be used to make generalized predictions about the sexual standards of other societies, it is missing something. Humans don't just have sex as a procreation strategy. We do it because we enjoy it. The Bateman-Shriver's principles also constitutes a just so story, a conclusion drawn not necessarily because we have evidence for it, but because it would kind of make sense if it were like that, and we haven't found anything that disproves it. Except, we kind of have found evidence that disproves it. Now, I'm going to get into more specific cultural examples later on in this video, so stay tuned, friends. But for now, I will just say this. When we say women are just less likely to engage in casual sex, this may prove true as a rule of thumb, but when we then extrapolate from that and say that it's an innate rule of nature, we are taking our own cultural context, rationalizing it as a universal rule, ignoring how other cultures worked in the past, and then saying it's just biology, bro. It's easy for us to say, well, look at how things work all over the world now, but this ignores that we live in a much more globalized world, dominated by far fewer religions and ideologies, and with much more clear world hegemons than in the past. We can also find entire species that have similar reproductive systems to our own that entirely buck this trend of higher female investment, lower male investment. For instance, female katydids fight with one another over male katydids. Moreover, it's worth noting that the scientist for whom the principle is named, Angus Bateman, conducted his research on fruit flies, and scientists have been finding new discoveries about fruit flies which paint a more complicated picture than the one that Bateman had in mind. According to an article in Scientific American. In fact, a re-examination of Bateman's data from the lab of Patricia Gawadi of the University of California, Los Angeles, revealed, crucially, that a female fruit fly's reproductive success also increased with her mating frequency, a pattern that has emerged for a great many other species of animals. This puts a serious dent in their reasoning that, well, fruit flies have less sex due to evolutionary optimization. The same article also speculated that one possible reason why women are less likely to engage in casual sex could also be what classy people refer to as the orgasm gap. So because women are less likely to get off during sex, they are less likely to pursue casual encounters. But even if it were the case that women are less likely to engage in casual sexual encounters due to reproductive evolution, what would this prove? The fact that women normally do this has no bearing on how society should treat people who deviate from this norm. Furthermore, I'd like to direct you to a good video called
Evolutionary Psychology is Mostly Garbage,
which does a good job explaining how when casual observers see evolutionary psychology, people think that these psychologists are laying down an ironclad law, when in actuality they tend to be talking about the forces that tend to drive human behavior. As such, they don't tend to speak in terms of cultural inevitabilities.
Let me make this crystal clear. In principle, evolutionary psychology has all the makings of a real science with testable hypotheses. I think that most people who are casually aware of evolutionary psychology think that it's really focused on behavior. But in theory, it really isn't. So to use our Swiss Army knife metaphor, evolutionary psychology cares about studying and understanding all of the specialized tools in the knife. But it doesn't really care so much about what you do with those tools, except for maybe, data gathering purposes. Let me give a real example just to clarify this a little bit. An evolutionary psychologist might argue that it's an evolutionary advantage to have feelings of jealousy in a relationship rather than feeling indifferent if your partner's being too friendly with a rival mate. However, at a behavioral level, it's really difficult to predict how jealous that person will feel or how the jealous person will respond, because certain responses might be better or worse and maximize that fitness. Maybe they fight the rival, or maybe they get upset with their partner. or maybe they leave the relationship altogether. I mean, these could all be advantageous or disadvantageous depending on the situation. So evolutionary psychology, mostly ignores behavior and instead focuses on whether or not there's a pattern of jealous feelings. So in this specific example, those feelings of jealousy are part of a specific mechanism that produces the behavior.
Even if we do find that there's an innate impulse to slut shame, this wouldn't be the same as saying that slut shaming is desirable or inevitable. To take the stereotypical example, our biological impulses often drive us to rape, but we don't structure our society to support this impulse. So I saw this whatever podcast clip, which makes a couple of common claims about why body count is important. But, in my opinion, they're pretty easy to prove wrong, so I'm just gonna kinda rapid fire my way through them.
Really quick on the body count thing, I'll give you guys super quick reasons why body count matters. STDs, baggage and or trauma from past relationships. There's the loss and chipping away of your ability to pair bond. Your views and values as it relates to sex. It kind of says something about your behavior, decision-making, temperament. And you start, as you sleep with more men, you start becoming less and less satisfied with each extra dude. Really quick on the body count thing, I'll give you guys super quick reasons why body count matters. STDs.
Well, first of all, you should always check your partner for STDs regardless of how many partners they've had, since you can get STDs from activities that aren't sex. And once you've confirmed whether the results are positive or negative, then it's really not a problem, is it? Second, when we analyze the studies from earlier, you'll notice that the STDs didn't really play a role in the assessment of the sluts in the study. I mean, the study doesn't exclude the idea that STDs could play a part in the stigma supposed sluts face, but the things that sluts were degraded for were more fundamental moral and character traits, which seems to buck this idea of I'm just trying to avoid diseases.
Baggage and or trauma from past relationships.
What about the trauma of living her entire life lonely and having nobody who cared for her romantically? Or better yet, what about the trauma of just being alive? An infinite number of factors can impact whether or not someone has baggage or trauma, so to act like you know how somebody's past relationships have affected them strikes me as spurious. Maybe they're actually doing super good now and have gotten over their past relationships. Maybe they're not. You don't know.
There's the loss and chipping away of your ability to pair bond.
I'm assuming by this he means the ability to form successful relationships. This obviously poses the question of what it means to have a successful relationship, but for the sake of this segment, I'll keep it simple, and say that a successful relationship is one where both partners are happy and don't break up. Now, premarital sex does predict a greater likelihood of divorce, but the reason for why this is the case is still disputed. According to a study entitled Re-examining the Link Between Premarital Sex and Divorce, the authors note that we find the relationship between premarital sex and divorce is highly significant, and robust even when accounting for early life factors. Compared to people with no premarital partners other than eventual spouses, those with 9 or more partners exhibit the highest divorce risk, followed by those with 1 to 8 partners. What's interesting is that premarital sex with somebody who will eventually become your future spouse is also tied to a greater likelihood of divorce, though premarital sex with a partner who is not your future spouse predicts divorce to an even greater degree. Accordingly, one explanation for this tendency is that abstaining from premarital sex is a predictor of social conservatism, which would also predict a greater reluctance to divorce. However, this study rejects that link, stating that we find no support for theorized explanations from past work. The effect of premarital sex on divorce is robust to control for beliefs and values, religious background, family relationships, personality characteristics, and mental health in adolescence. But here's the kicker. Premarital sex predicts divorce in both men and women, so at the very least it's not like there's some mechanism unique to women that makes it more difficult for them to pair bond after multiple partners. So, what else can explain this link? Well, these studies have to be placed within the context of a society that stigmatizes past sexual relationships. For example, the process could go like this. Society stigmatizes past sexual encounters. The discovery of past sexual encounters leads to conflict in a relationship due to social stigma. This social stigma becomes a contributing factor to divorce. Is this proven? No. But neither is the claim that higher promiscuity in your past biologically repulses men. At the end of the day, even professional social scientists are still banging their head against this problem, so it'd be weird for me or some random podcast man to assert that we know exactly what's driving this trend. Just as a final note, in this study, it was unclear whether in some of these cases there was an additional sexual partner while the marriage was ongoing, which may skew the data.
Your views and values as it relates to sex, it kind of says something about your behavior, decision-making, temperament.
Yes, what somebody does says something about who they are, but if the behavior isn't negative, then it doesn't say anything negative. So in order for the statement to have any meaning, you would have to first establish that it has some sort of correlation with other outcomes or psychological traits first.
And you start, as you sleep with more men, you start becoming less and less satisfied with each extra dude.
I couldn't find much data on whether or not past sexual partners influence current sexual satisfaction. The best I could find is a very brief paper from the 2010 Undergraduate Research and Scholarship Conference from Boise State University, which stated, "It was expected that an increased number of previous sexual partners would negatively influence emotional attachment and sexual satisfaction in current romantic relationships. However, there was not a significant relationship between number of previous sexual partners and level of emotional attachment or degree of sexual satisfaction in current romantic relationships. Results suggested that past sexual experience may not be an important factor in determining the quality of current romantic relationships." So, to summarize, there's not much data either way, and what little data there is directly contradicts what Mr. Whatever Man is saying. Let's move on, shall we? Next, I want to talk about the tragedy of the commons argument.
So this was to do with slut shaming. Female promiscuity has a tragedy of the commons effect in the mating market. If one woman offers blowjobs on the second date, it's harder for other women to keep them in reserve until the fourth date as their special treat. This creates a downward spiral of young women feeling like they have to offer more sex and to more guys just to stay in the mating game. Thus, slut shaming is a way of enforcing a more restrained sexual norm on other women, so that not all women have to become more promiscuous than any one of them would like.
First of all, this is kind of a gross way to put it, since the tragedy of the commons has to do with the shared access to resources, with women assumedly being the resource in this scenario, so kind of dehumanizing. Also, even if we grant that it's true that this sort of tragedy of the commons logic is the reason why slut-shaming happens, should slut-shaming happen is the question. Also, I don't know about you, but when I have sex or talk with a woman, I'm not playing this weird 4D chess game in my head. Not even just because it would be a shitty thing to do, but also because it would be exhausting to constantly do that. It's an exhausting way to live. Also, as we're going to see in these examples, coming up real soon, I pinky promise, this is not a behavior that is universally engaged in. So if you do play this weird game, just know that not everybody does. It also paints a picture of women as being pretty sex repulsed, since the kind of failure state is that women have to have sex. In which case, buddy, have you considered this might be a you problem? Another problem is, it's not like men are universally considered the horny sex, though that's usually the case. But for instance, consider the Anang of Nigeria. The Anang believe that all adults possess strong libido, but that women far surpass men in their sexual needs, to the extent of posing at times a dire threat to both the physical and spiritual power of males. The thing is, there are several societies that do not have this sort of anxiety about sluts. Right now, society tends towards slut shaming, perhaps partially due to the wide reach of socially conservative religions like Christianity and Islam. But other societies have been much more libertine in the past, and continue to be more libertine in some places that are not first world English-speaking countries. Before we take a look at these more libertine places, though, it's worth mentioning one more thing. The anthropological study of sex has a big limitation. This is that sex is usually something private, so when we talk about how societies view sex, we usually have to do so during interviews, which open the door to things like lying or subjective interpretations of events that are perhaps not always the most rigorous. That being said, comparative research has been done to clear up discrepancies in the accounts, and we now have a relatively reliable record of how many societies behave pre-colonization. Consider this article about pre-colonial Hawaii. The Western concept of marriage did not exist in Hawaii, and even if a common definition of marriage is applied, sexual/genital interactions were socially accepted in many non-marital and non-committed relations. The concepts of premarital and extramarital sexual activities were absent, and it was probably true of Hawaii, as it was said to have been true of much of Polynesia, that there are no people in the world who indulge themselves more in their sensual appetite than these. In traditional Hawaii, nudity was not seen primarily as being sexual. Warm climate often dictates less clothing. The basic dress was a malo, loincloth for males, and a leaf or tapa, bark, skirt for adult females. The female breasts were not covered. Very young children went uncovered. A young male was permitted to wear a malo only after he had begun to live in the hale mua, men's house, usually between the ages of 4 and 6. Once the pubic hair began to grow, the genitals were covered, reportedly out of respect for the piko mai, genitals, and to protect the organs that gave progeny. A tapa robe might be added for protection against the cold or sun, not for modesty. That being said, the incredible openness about sex did manifest itself in some aspects that we would not want to adapt from Hawaiian society. Encouraging young adolescents to have sex with one another comes to mind. Kinda weird. In Polynesia, more generally, adults were reported to have sex with prepubescents. To spell it out and make things clear, these things are bad, and these things can go hand in hand with openness about sex. However, it's my belief that we can take the positive things from more open societies and also say that these things are bad. Consider also the Moso, a subdivision of the Na-ethnic group in China. In his book, A Society Without Fathers or Husbands, the Chinese anthropologist Tsai Hua states that, among the diverse groups that the Han, the ethnic majority of China, refer to as Moso, those that live in Yongning and its surrounding areas refer to themselves as Na. They are mountain farmers and have a population of approximately 30,000. Even today, women and men from this ethnic group freely engage in sexual relations with several partners and change them whenever they so desire. The man visits the woman at night in her house, where she lives with her sisters and brothers from the different generations of her lignée, and in the morning he returns to his own lignée's house, the habitat that constitutes the exclusive economic center of his work, production, and consumption. There is no economic bond between the partners. The children born of this sexual commerce will be a part, invariably, of the mother's lignée, whose members see to their upbringing without any intervention whatsoever from their genitor. He is only identified by his resemblance to the child. Sometimes, since a woman has different sexual partners, he is not even known. Moreover, I have not found any term that would cover the notion of father in the Na language. Their terminology for kinship is strictly consanguineal and matrilineal. The transmission of inheritance is carried out from one generation to the next, collectively.
因为女朋友这个跟我在一起的话是不可能的事情，因为我们主动权是在男方这一边，因为他缠我是不可能来到我家，因为我这才有主动权去完身到他家去走婚，因为只有我才会犯他，他不会犯我们。也许可能，也许不可能，这个感情这种东西也许说不清楚，因为摩梭人这种感情比较特殊，有点神秘。因为在我们摩梭人当中，有些时候我不敢保证他完全不变心，我也不敢保证我是完完全全能不背叛他，因为受到一些因素以后，人的心真的是男人，特别是男人了嘛，可能是会背后可能会。菜板上的肉哪里有不吃啊？个，因为在我来说，是因为我不可能是代表整个摩梭人，因为我来说的话，只能代表我自己。因为我在大城市里面找到一个工作，可能是再好的工作，也可能接受不了这种 让我失去家人跟家人分开的那种概念去过生活，因为我这个大家庭的话，过起来好像是一种和谐的一个大家庭。
By contrast, consider the case of Inishbog, which was the pseudonymous name given to the island of Inishir, Ireland, by the anthropologist John Cowan Messenger. According to Messenger, the people of this island taught that sex was a duty to be endured. Scandalous stories would be exchanged of girls bathing naked, which meant exposing their shoulders and lower thighs. This tied into the belief system that sex was something debilitating, that saps you of your energy. Can we conclude from Inishbog that it's only natural to be scandalized by women showing their shoulders? It also should go without saying that we don't need to go back in time to find differences in sexual values. We can look at different cultures right now. For instance, Russians were more likely than Americans to endorse what is called a traditional double standard. That is to say, an explicit belief that sexual standards for men and women should be different. However, to even view societies on this scale of permissive versus prudish can be an oversimplification. Every society places rules on sexual encounters, but the degree to which different rules are emphasized varies by culture and individual. To take a pretty basic example, the sexual rules of a first date are much more prudish than those with your wife. The sexual rules of dating a conservative in the Deep South are not the same as dating a sex-positive feminist in the same Deep South. Interpersonal and spatial dynamics are highly informative to the degree to which people can be expected to have sex and how that sex is performed. That is to say, context dictates when, where, and how you fuck, a dynamic that is not so easily categorized into simplistic terms like prudish versus libertine. What we can say is that while rules and regulations on sexual life exist everywhere, and certain places and times can be seen as appropriate context for sexual encounters, we can generally say that more sexually liberal places exist, and that there are several benefits to living in such a society. And when we say that society encourages or discourages sexual behavior, the word society can often be pulling a lot of weight in that statement, and that sexual rules do not universally hold true across a large population like that of the United States or another large first world nation state. We can also say that slut-shaming is natural because all societies place restrictions on sex, but that statement obfuscates the very real ways in which different societies have had different ways of understanding different rules, and the agency of individuals in those societies to accept those rules, reject those rules, or create their own subcultures with different rules. The very fact that you would have a large group of people that would reject a concept such as slut-shaming attests to the fact that you can have large groups of people reject conservative sexual beliefs, and if they can do it, so can you. When people go from intolerant of promiscuous behavior to tolerant of it, they aren't flipping a gene on and off, they're making an active choice to engage with culture differently. So, why do I say all this? Well, it's to prove that slut-shaming and sluttiness as a social category is not something stable and unchanging, but rather something that exists on a spectrum and is changing all the time. Because of this, it seems weird to me when people say, well, we can't change slut-shaming culture because of evolutionary biology, when there are cultures that are both more open and less open than ours. Imagine an inhabitant of Inishbog saying, well, women will always be shamed for showing their shoulder because that's the way of the world. It would be silly. In the same way that America is more open than other societies are more open than us, and understanding other cultures opens up the possibility that our own society can be different. I actually heard this point articulated really well in a place that I didn't expect. There's a website called thinkchristian.net, which had an article called What Christians Can Respect About Slut Walks. In it, the author Karine Rivadeneira wrote that, and I don't believe women should dress in a way that turns our, quote, temples of God into objects of lust, but honestly, I don't know how that can happen. From what they tell me, men are allured by all manner of dress. I mean, our culture has turned Catholic schoolgirl uniforms slutty. Teachers with prim skirts, buttoned-up blouses, tied-back hair, and glasses. Slutty. At least when men imagine her removing the glasses, shaking out her hair, right? And let's go a bit global. Right now I'm in tan Bermuda shorts, a black t-shirt, and flip-flops. Pretty standard mom fare on my block. Drop me in certain parts of Afghanistan? I'm just like a slut. One who deserves to be raped, perhaps to be stoned to death. So all of this still leaves the question, why do people slut shame? How has this one social norm become so seemingly omnipresent in our modern world? Well, there's the feminist perspective on slut shaming, which is that slut shaming represents a way of shaming women so that they fall in line with the objectives of a patriarchal society that seeks to control women and by extension their sexuality. However, while there could possibly be some truth to this, it doesn't actually answer the question of why men would want to control women's sexualities to begin with. Controlling when women drink water would also be a form of control over women, but modern society is much less preoccupied with that. The final hypothesis I want to bring to your attention is the class hypothesis. According to an ethnographic study published in Social Psychology Quarterly, quote, "We are unconvinced that women would engage so enthusiastically in slut discourse with nothing to gain." Synthesizing insights from social psychological research on stigma, gender theory, and cultural sociology, we argue that women's participation in this practice is only indirectly related to judgments about sexual activity. Instead, it is about drawing class-based moral boundaries that simultaneously organize sexual behavior and gender presentation. Women's definitions of sluttiness revolve around status on campus, which is largely dictated by class background. High-status women employ slut discourse to assert class advantage, defining their styles of femininity and approaches to sexuality as classy rather than trashy. Low-status women express class resentment, deriding rich bitchy sluts for their wealth, exclusivity, and participation in casual sexual activity. For high-status women whose definitions prevail in the dominant social scene, slut discourse enables rather than constrains sexual experimentation. In contrast, low-status women are vulnerable to public shaming. While I think this study represents an interesting direction to take theories about slut shaming, I think that it has its limitation. While the small sample size allows for more robust qualitative details on the participants, the small sample size also limits it in its scope, and so does the local context of which it takes place in, which is a Midwestern university. Therefore, it's not necessarily the case that we can expand these conclusions out to the entirety of America, let alone the entirety of the slut-shaming Western world. We can say things like men hate sluts, ignore the societal and historical context, then claim it's a natural fact of life, but this natural fact of life is already changing. According to a paper entitled Changes in American Adults' Sexual Behaviors and Attitudes, 1972 to 2012, in the nationally representative General Social Survey, U.S. adults, N equals 33,380, in 2000 to 2012 versus the 1970s and 1980s, had more sexual partners, were more likely to have had sex with a casual date or pickup or an acquaintance, and were more accepting of most non-marital sex, premarital sex, teen sex, and same-sex sexual activity, but not extramarital sex. The percentage who believe premarital sex among adults was, quote, not wrong at all, was 29% in the early 1970s, 42% in the 1980s and 1990s, 49% in the 2000s, and 58% between 2010 and 2012. Also, in this study from earlier, it was noted that chastity went from being rated as the 10th most important trait for both genders to 16th for men and 17th for women. You might be thinking, well, they might say that, but it's actually that they have to hide their real preference in a world overtaken by feminists, liberals, and wokies. Or whatever.
Paternity. It stems from paternity because men historically had to make sure that the kids were theirs, and historically we didn't have DNA tests. So if a girl was promiscuous and sleeping around, basically like the man wouldn't know that if the kid was his. So it's not even necessarily something they can like biologically help. Like it's just how they feel about it. And like guys might lie to you about this, but like guys feel this way.
Wouldn't even want to marry a virgin. Yeah, some of them would, but a lot of them feel like it's too much of a responsibility emotionally to deal with.
There we go.
That's
the answer, sir. That's the answer.
Yep.
This is in the context of being a Christian. He said a lot of men would not want to marry a virgin.
Interesting.
Because it would be too much responsibility.
You said to cleanse his sins off. It was an episode I did with Terry Ijeoma. It's called $40 Million Virgin.
Wow.
She's a very successful woman. She's $40 million strong. And she asked me on the episode, she's like, would you marry a virgin? I said, Now, for me, it went to the reason why I initially declined it is because it goes against my feeling of unworthiness. I felt like I would be unworthy to.
See, he got very vulnerable.
Yeah.
He got very transparent. He thinks it's because of his unworthiness.
Yeah.
In my opinion, that to me is a more honest answer.
Yeah, as to why you wouldn't want to. People are like, oh, so much responsibility. In reality, they're like, I done messed up too many girls' feelings, and now you waited, or you're like, you don't have a lot of that baggage.
But first of all, there's no evidence for this claim. I can't prove what somebody secretly believes either way, but I could just as easily assert that every man secretly wants a woman with 100 partners, and have the same amount of evidence. That amount being 0. Also, if you've decided, without evidence, that the entire world secretly thinks just like you, then I don't know what to tell you, since I don't think you're reasoned into your position to begin with. So, what am I saying with this video? What's the prescription? Am I saying that you have to open up your relationship immediately and start standing sex workers? No. If you still have preferences for monogamy or chastity, that's fine. Everyone has their own boundaries, and that's okay. What I am saying is that we, as a society, should be more introspective about our preferences for how women behave, and try to situate it within the context of our own societal conditions. And, when you express your preferences, bear in mind the way that that preference came about, and that there's a human being on the other side of that preference.
Kristen, Ben, let's see your guns. There's some whores. What is up? They're indoctrinating 2-year-olds in this house. There's some whores in this house. I said certified freak. Kristen, Ben, 7 days a week. What is up? Wet ass keyword. Make that pull out. It's the mentally ill. It is a really, really large. Why would you ever put your kids in the hands